Welcome everyone to this seminar on Ibrahim alayhi salam, the principal individual who established monotheism. And so I want to take a look at the character of Ibrahim and some of the mystical dimensions of Prophet Ibrahim and the haqiqah, which has been, or the reality of Ibrahim, which has been identified or mentioned by many Sufi scholars and mufassirin. And the reason why Ibrahim is important, as we know, is that in the Quran we find that Islam is attributed to Ibrahim. Ibrahim is the progenitor, the forefather of Islam as we know it today. So it is founded on the principles established by Ibrahim and culminates in the character of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon them. So in other words, Ibrahim alayhi salam is the father of monotheism. He is not only the progenitor of the Prophet in terms of the lineage, but also in terms of the spiritual path and the spiritual lineage of Prophet Muhammad, and our own spiritual lineage goes back to Ibrahim. And so this is why we see that many of the rites and rituals of Hajj and many things in Islam return back to Ibrahim and the actions or the events concerning Ibrahim's life. So while Muslims follow the sunnah of our own Prophet, namely Prophet Muhammad, to the exclusion of the sunnah of other prophets, we find that the Quran teaches that even Prophet Muhammad himself followed in the footsteps of Ibrahim. For example, in the verse of the Quran, Surah 16, verse 23, he says, "When we reveal to you, O Muhammad, to follow the creed of Ibrahim, Millat Ibrahim, a man of pure faith who was not a polytheist." And further acknowledged, namely the Quran acknowledged that Prophet Muhammad is worthy of Abraham insofar as he follows him. He says, "Truly those who are the worthiest of Abraham are those who followed him, and this Prophet, and those who believe." Meaning this Prophet Muhammad is the worthiest of following Ibrahim. So then what are the specific teachings concerning Abraham besides monotheism that can be gleaned from the narratives in scripture, in hadith, or in the mystical tradition? So I wrote a paper on this very topic, and it's called "The Religion of Abraham, Sufi Perspectives on the Abrahamic Reality." So the paper begins with a discussion of some of the major ideas within the school of Ibn al-Arabi, which is one of the more most metaphysically rich schools in Islam. And so I begin the paper talking about how Ibn Arabi describes Prophet Ibrahim, and much of this information is coming from Ibn al-Arabi's book Fusus al-Hikam. Fusus al-Hikam is this book where Ibn al-Arabi identifies the prophetic or the spiritual reality of 27 prophetic figures. Now, not all of those individuals mentioned in that book are prophets. For example, Luqman is mentioned, or Khalid is mentioned. But in the case of Ibrahim, Ibrahim is definitely factors into one of the major figures of this tradition. And so Ibn al-Arabi designed this book, Fusus al-Hikam, and the Fusus is the plural of the word fas, which means, it actually means ringstone. But in this usage, it means wisdom or the summative knowledge received by each prophetic spirit mentioned in this book. So each fas is that gemstone or the essential knowledge that that particular prophet receives. Or it could mean the ringstone itself, the gemstone. And if it means this, then it means the heart within which is inscribed the knowledge specific to each prophet. In any case, the point here is not a commentary on Fusus al-Hikam. I want to get to the main topic of Ibrahim. So the first half of the paper discusses Ibrahim according to Ibn al-Arabi and Qunawi and some of his followers. And then the second half is gleaned from the teachings of my teacher, Dr. Akram al-Majid. And you'll find that there is a significant shift between the description of Ibrahim in the Fusus and how Dr. al-Majid identifies the Abrahamic reality. So let me begin. We'll come back to the Ibn Arabi section because it's quite lengthy and we only have an hour. So I want to get into the main part of the paper, and then we can go back and talk about the Ibn Arabi's statements on it in the Futuhat. So first of all, what do we mean by the maqam Ibrahim? So this paper is essentially about the station of Abraham, the station meaning maqam. Now, in general, when we talk about maqam, in Sufism, it refers to a station, a place of arrival. But in the common discourse, when we say maqam Ibrahim, many people think that it is the place where Ibrahim stood. And this is also correct. But the maqam, and we'll talk about both of these. So the maqam refers to an enduring and stable quality of the heart. So it's a station, and that refers to an enduring quality of the heart. But it can also refer to the ultimate degree and rank of a prophet or saint. So here we're not just talking about the maqamat as in the different realities or qualities of Ibrahim. We are talking about the qualities of Ibrahim, but we're also talking about the ultimate quality, the ultimate degree. What is the Abrahamic fundamental reality? This is what we want to know. So if we say the fundamental Ibrahimi reality might be gleaned from this word Khalil, Ibrahim Khalilullah. And this appears in the hadith. Or we say, for example, Musa Kalimullah. Musa is the interlocutor, the one who speaks to God, the one who converses with God. Whereas Ibrahim, the word Khalil, means friend or companion. And we'll talk about this word Khalil momentarily. So when we say the station of Ibrahim, particularly we're referring to this ultimate reality. How can we describe Abraham in a sentence or in a few words? Or is there a singular reality that describes Abraham? It might be the word Khalil, because this appears in the Quran. But there are other descriptions of Abraham. So we want to look at the Abrahamic reality kind of more holistically and extrapolate all the particulars that are mentioned in the Quran that describe the Abrahamic reality. So there isn't exactly one, but it alludes to a singular reality. So the Quran does mention this idea of Maqam al-Ibrahim as the place where Abraham stood. He says, we made the house, meaning the Kaaba, the Haram, a meeting place and sanctuary for the people. This is the house of God. Enjoining them. And this is very appropriate at this moment as the Hajj is proceeding. So all of the Hajj rituals revolve around the narrative of Ibrahim. Even though it is said in the hadith that Adam alayhi salam first built the Kaaba, it is Ibrahim who revived it and dedicated as the house of God. So it is attributed to the house Ibrahim built. And it says in the Quran, take for yourselves the station of Ibrahim as a place for prayer. And then we made a covenant with Abraham and Ismail, his son. He says, God said, purify my house. for those who complete the circuits, the tawaf, and those who cleave to it, and those who bow and prostrate themselves. Surah Baqarah, verse 125. So as there is a geographical place for the Maqam al-Ibrahim, so when you go to Mecca and you go to near the Kaaba, there's a place where Ibrahim stood and he prayed and so on, and that's called the Maqam Ibrahim, the physical place. But there is also a cosmic reality. When we say Maqam, we're actually referring to the cosmic reality. And so, in another verse, this is intimated by another verse which says, God speaks the truth. It says, say, God speaks the truth. Follow the religion of Abraham, a man of pure faith. And the word Hanif is used. We'll discuss the word Hanif momentarily. He says, he was not one of those who associate others with God. The first house established for the people was at Bakka, meaning Mecca, a blessed place and a guidance for created beings. Surah number 3, verse 96. Again, in the Quran, there's a lot of mention of Ibrahim in the Quran. And it says, in it are clear signs, including the station of Abraham. And those who enter it are safe. Again, Surah Baqarah, Surah number 2, verse 125. So, according to these verses, the station of Abraham aligns with the attributes of truthfulness, pure faith, and monotheism, secured by clear signs and guidance. Now, Sadruddin Qunawi, who's Ibn al-Arabi's student, writes that the significance of the first house established by Abraham is this. He says, the Kaaba, which was the first house built for humanity, corresponds to the reality of the world, receptive of the first engendering from its originator. So everything has a first. There's a first intellect, a first soul, a first house. Everything has a first. And so the Kaaba is the first. And it reflects this idea that it comes directly from God. With respect to the attribute of power, which is the first intellect in its form. And so it says that it was created by the attribute of power, according to Ibn Arabi. That is why it is called the pen, the qalam, because the pen is attached to the hand. So, from this perspective, Ibrahim is the manifestation of the first intellect, which is the first existential and engendering cause. So, now we have some more description about Ibrahim. Firstly, Ibrahim was a Hanif. And Hanif comes from the word Hanafa, which means to incline. And we'll talk about Hanif in a moment. But right now, Qunawi and others, along with mention in the Quran, talks about the first intellect. Ibrahim is the manifestation of the aql, or the first intellect, which is the first existential and engendering cause. And so, Ibn al-Arabi has a lot to say about this in the Futuhat. I'm going to skip over this section and we're going to go straight and talk about another aspect that Ibn Arabi mentions. And he says that Ibrahim, his person, all of the prophets, each one of them reached a particular plane in the gnosis of God, or a certain level, a degree. And so the Abrahamic degree is one which manifests the affirmative attributes. So if we say that the divine attributes are divided into the transcendent and affirmative. Ibrahim was the first mirror to reveal the properties of affirmative attributes. I'll explain this in a moment. In Fusus, Ibn al-Arabi says that Nuh, Prophet Nuh, who came before Ibrahim, and also Idris, both of Nuh and Idris understood God with respect to transcendence. So when we say the statement Subuhun Quddusun, so both Subuh and Quddus are expressions of God's transcendence. When do we say Subuh? We say God is glorified. Or when we say He's Quddus, or sacred, sanctified. So both of these terms refer to God's transcendence, that God is beyond understanding, beyond what we can contemplate. And so Noah's understanding and Idris's understanding of God was that of transcendence. And there's another kind of understanding of God, which is one of immanence, or what is known as the affirmative attributes. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam came with a new type of knowledge. So this is important, that each prophet brings with them a new form of knowledge. Prophet Muhammad came to bring a knowledge that the previous prophets did not have. And likewise, each prophet comes and it completes the picture of divinity and beyond. Not just divinity, they bring knowledge of the world, they bring knowledge of the universe, of existence, and so on. And so this is true even today. Every new generation brings forth with them a new kind of knowledge, a new revelation, as it were, a new self-disclosure of God. Even the discovery of electricity is a new kind of knowledge. And there are so many inventions that happened in the past several hundred years. All of this reflects different and emerging types of knowledge. But that refers to material knowledge, which is valuable and valid. Here we're talking about spiritual knowledge and spiritual technology. So Ibrahim came with a new kind of knowledge, which was the knowledge which combined both the transcendent and the affirmative attributes. And I'm not going to linger on this point too much because it does require a great amount of focus and concentration and a lot of background. But I will just say a few things. So we do have a hadith that Jami quotes. He says, the first whom God will clothe on the day of judgment is Ibrahim. And in this sense, he means clothed with the attributes. Or that, so we'll leave that for now. And we'll go on and talk about what Ibn al-Arabi says about the essence. He says, the Quran says, God took Ibrahim as an intimate friend, Khalil. Okay, so this is a very important description of Ibrahim. وَاتَّخَذَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ خَلِيلًا. So the word Khalil, it comes from this word khalala or takhallul, which means to permeate and infuse. Even though many people translate this word as friend, it is friend. It means friend in common discourse. But we have to go back and we have to understand the linguistic origin of this word. So Khalil is intimate friend, and it comes from the root idea to permeate and infuse. So what's the connection here? The connection here is that calling Ibrahim the friend meant that Ibrahim permeated, or the divine essence permeated and encompassed the whole of Ibrahim, like a color that permeates its object. So we have two kinds of permeation here, or infusion. One is takhallul, of God's permeation in the form of Ibrahim. And then there is also Ibrahim's permeation in the identity or the attributes of God. So there is an intrinsic reciprocity between God and the human being. In the first case, Ibrahim permeates the divine form. And in the second case, God permeates the form of Ibrahim. So, if God is the one who is external, then creation is concealed in him. So creation assumes all the divine names: his hearing, his sight, his perception, and characteristics. What it means here is that, this is a quote from Ibn Arabi. So if we understand God to be external, then creation is within God. However, if creation is viewed as what is external, then God is hidden and concealed within it. And God assumes its hearing, vision, hand, and foot, and all of its faculties mentioned in the hadith. So we can look at things as everything is God, or everything is a manifestation of God, and God is external. God is ever present. And this is a kind of a perspective. We have two things. We have God and creation. And so either God is external and then creation is hidden within God, or that creation is external. In other words, you see the world, you see creation, and you say, where is God? God is hidden. So these are two perspectives of looking at the world. In any case, from either perspective, God pervaded Ibrahim and infused him with the divine character. And khulla is also a state of annihilation. In other words, annihilation is the cessation or the annihilation of the human aspect in the divine aspect. And in contrast to annihilation is subsistence. So first you have the human being and the human material form. That human being transcends their own human form and becomes one or annihilates in the divine form. And this has to do with attributes. It has to do with the reality of the aspect of humanity becomes preponderates to the aspect of divinity. This is a difficult concept. Annihilation is like the drop of water which has an identity, but when it merges into the ocean, it's still, we have to question whether or not that drop of water exists anymore. It does exist, but now it has annihilated, it has become one with the ocean. So you can identify the separateness of the drop before it merges with the ocean. And similarly, the human form is separate with respect to attributes, with respect to realization. But when the human being becomes realized, actualized, then that human being becomes merges with the whole of creation. And so the aspect of separateness becomes annihilated. So two become one. This is what annihilation means. It doesn't mean non-existence. So those are some of the ideas that Ibn al-Arabi talked about. And now we're going to go and talk about some of the particulars of the station of Ibrahim. As we said, that the station of Ibrahim or Ibrahim alayhi salam is the manifestation of the first intellect, which is the first existential and engendering cause. What does that mean? It means this, that God, the first thing that God created was the intellect. In other words, God created intelligence. The very first thing, He didn't create the cosmos, He didn't create the planets or the universe or any human being. The first thing that God created was intelligence. And intelligence means consciousness. So the very first thing to appear to become manifest is awareness, consciousness. And the traditional sources call that intellect or intelligence. And this intellect, this consciousness, is also referred to as the station of reality. And why is it called the station of reality? Because this is the thing which originated first from God. God is the real, the whole of reality is God. And so the first thing to emanate from God was the mirror of this reality, of himself. And so when we talk about the pure, the highest intellect, which is called the first intellect, it is the source of immediate knowledge, which perceives without interpretation, and it reveals itself without form, materiality, image, or representation. Why does it do that? Because the nature of the intellect is to know things as they truly are, whereas the nature of the imagination is to represent things in a form. So, for example, if you can imagine the form of an object, the chair, think about a chair or a table or fire. In your mind, you can imagine those things because they have a form. But can you imagine the form of love or justice? Perhaps you can represent those realities, but the meaning of love and justice occur to the intellect. They are abstractions, pure abstractions. And it is the mind, meaning the intellect, which perceives it in and of itself. Now, you might be able to explain it through a metaphor, analogy, a poem, a story, some form which requires the imagination to interpret the idea of justice or virtue or any of these absolute, these abstract notions. So this is the maqam of the intellect, which is the maqam of Ibrahim, which is the first manifestation of reality. It is also the engendering cause of all things. So in other words, everything originated from the intellect. Everything originated from consciousness. And so to say, for example, modern science are still trying to discover whether or not the universe has a consciousness, whether or not it's just material. Is there they're struggling whether or not there's God, and so on. So in our tradition, in the spiritual traditions, not just Islam, but most, if not all spiritual traditions, posit that God is an intelligent and aware being. That's the definition of God. And the first thing that God emanated, brought into being, brought forth, revealed of himself, was consciousness and intelligence. The very first thing. And everything came out of intelligence. Everything came out or emerged from consciousness. So, contrary to material science, which is questioning whether or not the universe has a consciousness, we say that the entire universe is nothing but consciousness. And everything, every individual thing, whether animate or inanimate, on some level is connected to that consciousness and possesses consciousness. It possesses a certain kind of awareness and different forms of awareness. So when we talk about the first intellect or the station of reality, this is the plane which is the most aware, the absolutely aware. It is aware through itself because there's nothing else in existence. It is the first intellect, the first thing to be. It doesn't have eyes and ears because eyes and ears come after. They're organs. They interpret. Even the imagination came afterwards. This is the first thing that God created. So it necessarily corresponded to reality. And there is no place for interpretation here. And so this is actually relevant because we come to this whole idea. We'll talk about Ibrahim and the dream that he saw of him sacrificing his son. So when Ibrahim saw this dream, he saw from the vision of reality. Why? Because Ibrahim is accustomed to this world of reality. He represents the intellect. And the intellect is the plane of knowing things as they truly are. And so there is an ascension. Ibrahim is moving. He has a development. He's developing as a human. And part of that development is for him to see the dream, is also as the Quran describes his own ascent in the following allegory. The Quran says, when the night grew dark over him, over Ibrahim, he saw a star and he said, this is my Lord. But when it set, he said, I do not like things that set. And when we saw the moon rising, he says, this is my Lord. And when it set, he says, unless my Lord guides me, I will surely be among the people that go astray. Then he saw the sun rising and cried, this is my Lord, this is greater. But when the sun set, he said, my people, I disown all that you worship besides God. So Ibrahim doesn't believe that the star, the sun, and the moon are the Lord. Okay? This is an allegory. And each one of these is a symbol for a different meaning. And the stars in this case refers to the imaginal world. He's not looking at the physical stars and saying, this is my Lord, this is God. Ibrahim is far beyond that. Ibrahim is the paragon of monotheism. He's a prophet. He's inspired. Ibrahim is the manifestation, the first mirror of the first intellect, or the complete mirror of the first intellect. Ibrahim is at the station of reality. Ibrahim is the founder of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad even follows Ibrahim. So when someone thinks that in his mind that he interprets that Ibrahim looked at the stars and he believed that this is the Lord, this is a complete misrepresentation of this verse. And to read this verse, one must understand the symbols of the Quran. So the Quran is speaking in symbolic language. The language of the Quran is different from the language that we speak. Even you and I, if we look at the sun, no one's going to say that's God. So if you and I will not look at the sun and the moon and say that's God, of course Ibrahim won't do that. So here the stars refer to the imaginal world because they are the points of guidance for people. They're landmarks. And God granted Ibrahim the knowledge of the imaginal world, represented by the stars. So he had immediate awareness of his own state when he looked at the stars and he says, I am ill. Surah 37, 88, verse 88. Surah 37, verse 88. So even though the stars provide inward and outward guidance for mankind owing to their elevated position, the Muhammadan ascent surpasses it. The Quran describes his ascent in the following words, meaning the Prophet Muhammad's ascent. So Ibrahim had an ascent, meaning he went from one station to the next, from the stars, the moon, and then to the sun. The Quran describes the Muhammadan ascent in these words. He says, by the star, when it sets, your companion Muhammad has not strayed, nor has he erred. Taught to him by one mighty in strength on the high horizon. Then he drew near and became suspended until he was 2 bow lengths away or even closer. So having received direct knowledge from the highest horizon, the Prophet Muhammad surpassed the guiding knowledge of the imaginal world. So in other words, when the star set, meaning the imaginal world was put aside, it's set, it didn't cause the Prophet to swerve or turn his gaze away from God. Why? Because the prophetic Prophet Muhammad's station is the highest spiritual station. And it corresponds to the throne of the heart. Whereas the second station to the prophetic, the Muhammadan station, is the Abrahamic station, which corresponds to the throne of the intellect. And we see that the heart is the monarch, the heart is the king, and the intellect is the vizier. But you'll find that between these 2 thrones, between the heart and the intellect, Ibrahim was governed by the station of the intellect. And this corresponds in the outward to the sun and the moon. So both the sun and the moon correspond to intellect and heart. In other words, the praiseworthy station, the Maqam Mahmud, which is the praiseworthy station of Muhammad, was the heart and the sun. And the station of Ibrahim was the intellect and the moon. And so the divine light which enters into the heart is like the sun which shines its light onto the moon. And then the moon becomes illuminated. And so in the elemental world, his place of worship is represented by the Kaaba, where he left his footprints in stone. Take the standing place, as the verse says, take the standing place, the maqam of Ibrahim, as a place of prayer. And so because of Ibrahim is of the intellect, he has a correspondence with luminous bodies. So he talks about stars, moon, and the sun. And so Ibrahim, from this perspective, is the manifestation of the divine name An-Nur, the light. This relates to his station of the intellect, because the intellect is a light. Just as the Prophet says, the Hadith says, the intellect is a light that God created for mankind. He made it illuminate. So the heart, he made it illuminate the heart so that it could distinguish between the seen and the unseen. So the intellect is a light, it's a lantern. And Ibrahim's station is the aql. He sits on the throne of the intellect. And the intellect is light. So this is, now we're putting all these different pieces together. We have Ibrahim as the manifestation of the intellect. The intellect is the station of reality, of haqiqah. And that is also, the intellect is a light. So Ibrahim relates to Ismullah An-Nur. Now, what are some of the other divine signs mentioned in the Quran that represent the station of Ibrahim? It is also, when we take these 2 things together, the intellect, Ismullah An-Nur, we find that the intellect is also the station of the spirit. In other words, when the light of the intellect reaches perfection, it reaches the degree of the spirit. So, someone who has intellect or intelligence, and they perfect that intelligence, I'm talking about spiritual intelligence, and it reaches perfection, then it reaches the maqam of the ruh. The spirit, which is the source of life, is also referred to as the intellect. So these two words are somewhat interchangeable. Although the word spirit, ruh, generally refers to hayat, life. And whereas intellect refers to perception, thinking, understanding, awareness, consciousness. But in other contexts, they are both synonymous. So sometimes the spirit, which is the source of life, also refers to the intellect in religious discourse. So for example, the Prophet is reported to have said that God created the intellect from a hidden, treasured light in his ancient knowledge, of which neither a sent messenger nor a proximate angel had any awareness. In other words, the spirit is perhaps being referred to here in this hadith, because he says he created the intellect from a hidden light, a treasured light, in his ancient knowledge, in his knowledge that even the messengers or angels have no awareness. It comes directly from God. And so the spirit is the manifestation of the divine name, the living, Al-Hayy. So when the intellect reaches perfection, it becomes endowed with life. This is important. When intelligence becomes perfected, it becomes endowed with life. Intellect is not only the defining characteristic of the human being, but the human being is defined by the Spirit of God, that God breathed into Adam. So when God breathed into Adam his spirit, he endowed him with intellect. This is what it means. وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. He didn't just give him life, but he also endowed him with intelligence. And so the Quran connects light and life in the following verse. It says, he who was dead and we revived, we gave him life, having given him a light by which he walks amongst the people, is the one who was given life and light. And then with that light he walks amongst the people like the one who is in darkness. So this is Surah 6 verse 122. The deeds of the unbelievers are made to seem alluring to them. So the unbelievers are veiled. They're deluded. They're in illusion. And this is the meaning of darkness here. Darkness means veils and illusion. Whereas somebody who has light can see reality, see the truth. And when they have light, they also have life. And so because of this correspondence between intellect and life, Ibrahim was drawn to the name Al-Hayy. And so he asked, my Lord, show me how you give life to the dead. He says, do you not believe? He says, I do, but only so my heart is put to rest. In other words, Ibrahim wished to advance from the knowledge of certainty to the vision of certainty. So he resorted to the divine name Al-Hayy, the living, which governs the world of spirits and intellect. So Ibrahim is not only connected to intellect, to reality, but also to life. And this is the relevance of this story, this brief narration in the Quran when he says, my Lord, show me how you give life to the dead. And so this is relevant because of all the things that about Ibrahim's life that God could have included in the Quran. He quoted this statement of Ibrahim, this interaction. And so this interaction is relevant because the Quran is limited. It has only a set number of words. So it had to be, all the verses, all the words had to be chosen by God to for a very particular reason. And here we see that this verse corresponds to the life-giving nature of the intellect, which is manifested in Ibrahim. Now, a couple other qualities of Ibrahim. God said to Ibrahim, I'm going to make you an imam. So Ibrahim has a quality of imamate, or leadership. Not only did Ibrahim have imamate, Harun and some others had imamate as well, but Ibrahim was given imamate without intermediary. Inni ja'alun imaman linnas. Okay, so God says, I'm going to make you a leader, an imam of mankind. And then Ibrahim asked, will you make leaders from my descendants as well? This is an interesting question. God answered, my pledge does not include the unjust. So right here, imamate and justice are correlated. So leadership, the pledge does not include the unjust, because justice is the principle by which the intellect governs the self and society. In other words, without justice, there is no leadership. Leadership is only conceived in the context of justice. It is the principle by which validates leadership. So in spiritual discourse, those who are deficient in justice are deficient in intellect, and thus unfit for leadership. Now, there's another thing about the word imam. He says the station of leadership, according to Qushayri, he says the station of leadership means that one understands from God and then gives that understanding to created beings. So the imam, in the real sense, receives from God, is not a material leader in that sense, in the sense of a political leader. It is one who God appoints and who teaches and receives directly from God and acts as a mediator between God and creation. In his outward situation, the imam is with created beings. He walks amongst them and never ceases conveying the message. In his inner situation, he witnesses God, and the clarity of his state does not waver. And he says to mankind what God says to him. And this is from Qushayri. So we see that leadership is not only conjoined with justice, but it also means not leadership, but imamate, the leadership which we call the imam. So Ibrahim was made an imam, and anyone who assumes the office of the imam is the mediator between God and humanity. So it's not a simple task to become an imam. On the contrary, it is a divine appointment. And no one can assume imamate for themselves. Now, two more principles, or a few more I want to talk about. The other key feature of Ibrahim is that God called him a nation, an ummah. Kana Ibrahim ummah. Now this is a very interesting description, because ummah means nation. It means a people. But God refers to Ibrahim unto himself. The whole of Ibrahim is the nation. So he says, the verse says, Ibrahim was an ummah, was a nation, devoted to God, sincere in faith. He was not amongst the idolaters. Surah 16, verse 120. Explaining this verse, Qaysari writes, and this now he's going to explain the meaning of ummah. He says the spirits of the prophets are universal and encompass the spirits of those under their governance and their nation. Just as the particular names are subsumed under the governance of the universal names. And so God alludes to this by saying Ibrahim was a nation unto himself, devout, and so on. So what does ummah mean? Ummah refers to a nation or the collectivity of individuals. And so Ibrahim was the collectivity of all the spirits and intellects of his nation, because he was the consummate intellect, the perfected, the all-encompassing, the first intellect. And so the word ummah in this case also refers to aql, or intellect, or the collectivity of all the particular intellects. This is the meaning of ummah. Now, one of the characteristics of the superior intellect is compelling speech. So not only does the intellect have the power to perceive and understand, not only does it have awareness, but it also has bayan, expression, and compelling expression. So a person of strong intellect has compelling speech, or from the verse of the Qur'an, the conclusive argument. Imam Ali says, the intellect of a person is ascertained by the words that flow from his tongue. Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq said, God created the intellect out of four things: knowledge, power, light, and volition. And so knowledge is intrinsic to the intellect. But along with it is the power to communicate through speech. While the heart perceives realities in summary form, the intellect comprehends and articulates its detail. And this is why when we look at the speech of the prophets, firstly, the prophet brought a linguistic miracle. His miracle was not ordinary. His miracle was words, was speech, was bayan. And so the miracle of the Qur'an being words and expression and superior expression corresponds to the intellectual status of Prophet Muhammad. It is an indicator of his intelligence, because speech is a sign of intelligence. Compelling speech is a sign of intelligence. And the conclusive argument is a sign of intelligence. And so this is why a lot of intelligent people enjoy writing or debate and so on, or challenges, intellectual challenges, because it is a way to test and hone the intellect, to sharpen the intellect. So Ibrahim challenged the prevalent beliefs of his time. How did he do so? Through proofs and argumentation. When we look at the narrative of Ibrahim in the Quran, we see that he's not just calling people to monotheism, but we actually see a kind of logical argumentation. He says, when he said to his father and his people, he says, what are these images that you are devoted to? They said, we found our forefathers worshipping them. And so Ibrahim says, you and your forefathers have gone astray. In other words, his first argument is that Ibrahim says that you are astray because you follow blindly. So he negates blind conformity, because it perpetuates the cycles of ignorance, which is diametrically opposed to the intellect. Blind conformity, following the religion of your forefathers, even if it's Islam. If you follow the religion of your forefathers, you have undermined the very spirit of Islam, because Islam is founded on Abrahamic principles. And Abraham, the first thing he did was confront blind conformity. The first thing he did was to break down the idols of belief. And so Islam is founded on the destruction of idols, not just the physical idols in the Kaaba, but the idol of beliefs. And the idol of beliefs is supported and upheld through blind conformity. When you believe in the religion of your parents, of your forefathers, this is called blind conformity. Islam urges every individual to think on their own, to come to these conclusions on their own. So blind conformity differs from spiritual authority because knowledge, evidence, guidance, and light endorse spiritual authority, but they do not endorse blind conformity. Abraham then proceeds to smash his people's idols. The physical idols, meaning their beliefs. Leaving one. So this is interesting. They ask, was it you, Ibrahim, who did this to our gods? He says, no. It was done by this one, the biggest of them. Ask them if they are able to speak. So what kind of argumentation is this? What kind of proof? It's not a philosophical proof. So let me finish the verse. It says, confounded, they said, you know very well that they cannot speak. Ibrahim then said, shame on you and the things you worship besides God. Don't you have any intelligence? So Ibrahim's demonstration, his argument here, exposes the absurdity of idolatry. An argument that appeals to their innate powers of reasoning. He doesn't say, if A equals B, B equals C in some kind of logical syllogism. He appeals to their innate power of reasoning and thought. He talks about the absurdity of what they're doing. So, in the external, the lifeless idol symbolizes a barren intellect. Just as the idol cannot speak, the intellect has lost the ability to reason. And so, look at this, what he's saying here. He says, ask them if they are able to speak. Why does he appeal to speech? Because as we said, speech is connected with intelligence. So he says that these things are non-intelligent, just like you. So this idol is a symbol of the barren intellect that you possess. They represent you. You worship them. Whatever you worship represents you. The object of your worship is an indicator of you and what you are. And you are what you worship. And so these people were worshiping these mindless idols because they themselves were mindless, thoughtless. So just as the idol cannot speak, and speech is a sign of intelligence, here he's saying, Ibrahim is making the argument that the intellect, your intellect, has lost the ability to reason. So that Ibrahim's speech would prevail, God endowed Ibrahim with clarity of mind and sound judgment and compelling speech. So the Quran states, such was our argument we gave Ibrahim against his people. And to God belongs the conclusive argument. God confirmed Ibrahim. He says, we granted our mercy to all of them and gave them a noble reputation. And the word reputation, and we gave them a noble reputation. And this word in the Quran, if you read the Arabic, it says, lisana sidqin aliyan. This is interesting because the actual words means a truthful tongue. We gave them a truthful tongue. Lisan sidq. And it's an expression which means we gave them a noble reputation. So many translators will say, oh, we gave Ibrahim a noble reputation. But read the Arabic, go back to the original language, and you'll see that the actual word that God uses is lisan. We gave him a truthful tongue. It's only an idiom to use it as a noble reputation. And literally it translates to sublime speech of truthfulness. Sidqin aliyan. So sublime speech. What kind of speech? Truthful speech. And this aptly describes Ibrahim's truthful and compelling speech, characteristic of his station of the intellect. Okay, the last thing I want to mention, which is very important, is that the religion of Ibrahim is the primordial nature. Among the key characteristics of the intellect, as we said, because it is the first thing that God created, is primacy and origination. The first, as I mentioned in the hadith, it says the Prophet said the first thing that God created was the intellect. And Ja'far al-Sadiq's statement, God created the intellect as the first creation amongst the spiritual beings, proceeding from his light from the right side of the throne. Since the intellect is the first principle in existence, it is a manifestation of the divine names of origination. And what are those names? The living, al-Hayy, an-Nur, the light, and the originator, al-Fatir. So Abraham's worship of God through the divine name, the originator, is highlighted in the following verse. He says, Your true Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth, who originated them, and to whom I am a witness. So Ibrahim uses this word fatara, fatir, in his prayer. He says, I worship him who originated me, and he will certainly guide me. And why should I not worship the one who originated me? So look at all these clues in the Quran. Why is this word origination coming in every verse of Ibrahim's narrative? This is why the Quran is miraculous, because it's using language in this subtle way, but it indicates the true situation. It indicates a mystery. And so this is what's happening here, is that we are looking at the characteristic, the true nature of Ibrahim in the subtle language of the Quran. He says, I worship God who originated me. And why should I not worship the one who originated me? And then again, he says, and in 4 different places in the Quran, he says, I've turned my face as a true believer towards him who originated the heavens and the earth. I am not one of the polytheists. And so, Ibrahim constantly goes back to this idea of origination, of firstness, of primacy, of original being. Why does he do that? Why does he keep using this terminology in all of his speech, origination? Because it demonstrates the intellect's primordial relation to God. And this is demonstrated in his perfect monotheism. Because the intellect was the first in creation. The intellect knew no other. It was the first to be addressed by God when God says, by my might and majesty, I have not created anything better than you, nor more obedient to me, nor loftier, nor nobler, nor more honorable than you. So in other words, God is speaking to the intellect. He's saying, you, I have created as the best of creation, the first and the best. And by you I impose, by you I bestow, and by you I am acknowledged as one. I am worshipped, called upon, hoped for, yearned for, feared, and warned against. Reward is through you, and punishment is through you. So this is the aql. This is in the hadith, that reward and punishment is through the use of intelligence. Since it was the first, it was both the object of divine gaze and the exclusive witness to divine unity. In other words, Abrahamic monotheism is known as fitra, original nature. And this is why the term or the divine name Al-Fatir, the originator, appears over and over again. And this is why the Quran describes this kind of religion as this. In the following verse, it says, turn your face towards religion. Hanifan, inclining to the truth. And Hanif is what? The description of Ibrahim. Ibrahim was those who incline towards the truth, who turns their face, reorients themselves to truth and reality. And then the verse reads, فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا. In the primordial nature from God upon which He originated mankind. فَطَرَ النَّاسَ. So fitra is primordial nature which God originated mankind. And the verse says, there is no altering in God's creation. This is the ad-din al-qayyim. This is the upright, the immutable religion. But most of mankind do not know, do not recognize, do not realize this. This is Surah 30, verse 30. So remember this, 30:30 is the definition of Islam. It is referring to the Abrahamic monotheism. And so here the Quran indicates that true religion is man's return to his innate nature, which is predisposed to the knowledge of the Creator, of the Creator. It is predisposed to the knowledge of the Creator. Innate nature, fitra, when actualized, is the intellect's power to recognize divine unity. And this is the religion of Abraham. And the Quran says, who is better in religion than the one who submits his face to God, while being a doer of good, following the religion of Abraham, and inclining towards the truth. This summarizes this idea of the religion of Abraham being Hanif, being one who turns themselves to primordial fitra. And that primordial fitra is the intellect, is intelligence, is essential consciousness. So this is the religion of Abraham. You can reread the paper. Much of what I've said is directly from the paper. And you'll find the sources of the different verses and the different ideas in the footnotes. And inshallah, I will open up the floor for question and answers. And I think it's important to understand our relation to Prophet Ibrahim, not only to Prophet Ibrahim, but all the other prophets. We have a spiritual connection to the other prophets, not just Prophet Muhammad. Even though the final message of Islam, we follow the Muhammadan way, the Muhammadan Sharia, we have a spiritual connection to the different prophets, and each individual has some link to one prophet or another, in addition to Prophet Muhammad. And this idea is lost. And there's a section on spiritual inheritance that I didn't cover in the talk, but it's there in the paper. I would suggest going back and rereading that, and that's very important. Particularly if a person wants to engage in spiritual development, spiritual progress, suluk, sayyid and suluk, it's important to understand and to know, where are your spiritual roots? So people do a kind of a genetic DNA test, and they want to find out their roots. the genetic roots. Well, we also have spiritual roots. And it's important to identify what those spiritual roots are. But anyway, that's for another time. We'll talk about spiritual inheritance at another time. So to summarize, we mentioned a number of very important qualities of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Ibrahim was an iconoclast. He smashed idols. And this is the job of the intellect. The job of the intellect is to smash ignorance, is destroy, eradicate ignorance. Not just remove it lightly or gently. He smashed idols, is to eradicate it. So that's what light does. Light comes and it completely eradicates darkness instantly. It's immediate. And knowledge is the same for ignorance. As soon as you learn something new, it smashes the idol of ignorance instantly. So anyway, one of the things with Ibrahim's message was he's the station of aql and the station of haqiqah. And this is important when we go and explain, which we'll have to do in another time, explain the relationship between Ibrahim and Ismail and why this dream of Ibrahim is relevant. In other words, relevant to our discussion. How does the sacrifice or the potential sacrifice of his son Ismail relate to the maqam of Ibrahimi? What's the significance? What's the interpretation? Why did he see this in a dream? All of this, now we have at least some groundwork that we can now begin to interpret the dream and to see what are the symbols there. What is the meaning of that dream? And if there's nothing else, please go ahead and look at the paper. It was a combination of two major streams of thinking. One is Ibn al-Arabi in the first half of the paper, and the second half was my teacher's teachings. So I brought those two ideas together. And if you have questions, you can reach out to me. Inshallah, we'll hopefully see you all again in another session, another class or seminar. Take care, everybody. Ma salam.